Breaking news! The Russian army is preparing an offensive on the so-called belt of fortified cities in the Donetsk region. This includes Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. Moreover, they are planning to do this, repeating the tactic of an aerial blockade of the battlefield, which unfortunately has already worked before the capture of Pokrovsk and Huliai-Pol in 2025. This conclusion was reached today at the Institute for the Study of War. At the same time, generals of the General Staff of the Russian Federation have been breaking records for the number of assaults for the third month in a row, trying to fulfill the promises made to Vladimir Putin, in particular, to occupy the entire Donbas by the end of the year. Well, in response, Ukraine continues to systematically destroy Russian logistics. In the past 2 days, Wildberries warehouses in several regions, oil depots, and for the first time, a distribution center of a major supermarket chain have come under attack. And it's worth breaking this down in detail, because Russians have already started manipulating this topic. Let's break down, as they say, both fronts, the military and the logistics. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're approaching 300,000 subscribers, so I'd be grateful for every subscription. So, let's start with the main news, with what Russia is preparing in Donbas. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russian occupiers are repeating certain aspects of their campaign to impose an aerial blockade on the battlefield, which was conducted in the summer and fall of 2025 and created the conditions for an offensive at the end of 2025 in the area of Pokrovsk and Huliai-Pol. In 2026, the Russian army is conducting a similar campaign, this time targeting Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. The specifics are as follows. The Russian army is increasingly striking Ukrainian locomotives, which are critical for the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine. In July 2026, the military command of the Russian Federation supplied its units with 1,000 Molnia-type drones and gave the order to intensify strikes on Ukrainian logistics in Kramatorsk and the surrounding areas. At the same time, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the enemy targeted the crossings connecting the two key cities of the agglomeration, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Geolocated video published on August 2nd shows the aftermath of a strike by a Russian multiple-launch rocket system, which heavily damaged the Cherevkovsky Bridge in the eastern part of Sloviansk. And the logic behind this Russian tactic is basically clear. The destruction of such logistical hubs is intended to make it as difficult as possible for the Ukrainian armed forces to regroup and deliver ammunition before a possible intensification of ground operations. So, in other words, Russia is trying to cut off supplies first and only then send infantry forward, just like it did before Pokrovsk. And this is something to pay attention to so as not to repeat the situation from the end of last year. At the same time, the pace of the Russian advance remains extremely slow. According to analysts from the Institute for the Study of War, in July 2026, Russian forces advanced by only about 38 square kilometers, which averages just over 1 square kilometer per day along the entire front line. Well, and here, this is the most telling part. Despite such minimal progress, the number of assault actions by the Russian army in Ukraine in July set a record for the third month in a row. This follows from the calculations of the Ukrainian analytical project Deep State. According to Deep State, in July, Russian generals sent the Russian army to assault Ukrainian positions 8,800 times. Why is this the situation? Why the rush? Why such mass assaults? The thing is, the generals of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation promised the bold idiot Vladimir Putin that by the end of this year they will be able to fully capture the Donetsk region, where about 17% of the territory still remains outside the control of the unwashed Russians, including a 50-kilometer belt of fortress cities, in particular Konstantinovka, Drushkovka, Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. Moreover, according to Bloomberg, Putin is no longer willing to settle for just the Donetsk region. He believes that the US allegedly violated the anchorage agreements and wants full control over the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions as well, which were annexed in 2022. At the same time, some Russian military officials believe the deadlines given to Putin are unrealistic and think that the war for Donbas, as they call it, could drag on for another 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to disrupt Russian logistics inside Russia itself. Let's start with the episode that had the most severe consequences for Russians. On the morning of August 4th, Ukrainian drones attacked the city of Chekhov in the Moscow region. More warehouses were burning there. At the same time, the largest Wildberries logistics complex in the Leningrad region was attacked. In the settlement of Krasny Bor, covering an area of 154,000 square kilometers. By the way, this is the last and largest remaining warehouse of this marketplace in the region. Let me remind you of the context. On July 24, Ukrainian drones had already attacked 2 other Wildberries sorting centers in this same Leningrad region. The Utkina Zavod sorting center with an area of 18,000 square meters and the Shusheri center with an area of 106,000 square meters. The campaign of strikes specifically targeting Wildberries logistics infrastructure has been ongoing since July 18. And as of today, the total area of the company's warehouses that have been attacked has reached 1.5 million square meters. Well, by the way, now it can be said officially. The Wildberries warehouse in the Samara region that was attacked back on August 2nd is one of the company's 5 largest logistics hubs in Russia. It burned down completely, along with all the goods. The Russian authorities have finally acknowledged this. In addition, drones attacked the Syzran oil refinery and another Wildberries warehouse near Tver. But something happened for the first time last night. For the first time since the start of this campaign of strikes, Ukrainian drones attacked not Wildberries warehouses or oil refineries, but a supermarket chain's distribution center. We're talking about Lenta, one of the largest chains in the country, which has more than 700 stores and is controlled by Seva Group, owned by billionaire Alexei Mordashov. And here it's important to establish an honest context right away before drawing any conclusions. Russians are already shouting at the top of their lungs that Ukrainians struck a food warehouse. How could this happen? They call it terrorism and so on. Let's set the record straight. This is far from the first strike on food supplies. But now the roles have switched places. Let me remind you of the most recent episode. On the afternoon of August 3rd, literally on the eve of this Ukrainian strike, Russian forces struck food warehouses in Dnipro. Literally less than a day before that. An ice cream warehouse was destroyed. Its products were distributed throughout Ukraine. Before that, the unwashed Russians attacked poultry farms, attacked food warehouses, and so on. That is, it was the savage Russian side that was the first to strike at civilian food logistics. And this Lenta warehouse was already the Ukrainian response to this and many similar strikes on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. That's all. The war has become fully reciprocal, and Russians will have to experience all the hardships of war that Russia brought to Ukraine. Now let's talk about the consequences of this entire campaign for the Russian economy, because they are already systemic. Let's start with fuel. In Russia, amid the fuel crisis, hundreds of gas stations have started to close. Officially, 322 gas stations have stopped operating. That's 70 more than during the same period last year. The point is that there simply isn't enough gasoline in Russia for all the gas stations. So they decided to just shut down the stations. No, they're not trying to produce more gasoline. They physically can't do that. The oil refineries have been destroyed. They just started shutting down the gas stations. Long-range Ukrainian strikes this year have put 26 oil refineries out of commission. And oil refining in Russia itself has collapsed to the levels seen in 2002. And I want to share another piece of news with you, this time about Kazakhstan, which continues to be a source of unpleasant surprises. According to Kazakhstan's Minister of Trade, Arman Shakaliev, Kazakhstan will soon bring 260,000 square meters of Wildberries warehouse space online. The Russian Foreign Ministry has already stated that no, come on, this has nothing to do with Ukraine's strikes. They say that hundreds of thousands of Kazakhstani suppliers are already registered on Ozon and Wildberries, so the logistics and warehouses will simply be moved from Russia to Kazakhstan. At the same time, as of today, Wildberries is already renting 46,000 square meters of warehouse space in the Republic of Kazakhstan and is ready to take up all the available space in the country. Well, Kazakhs, be careful when letting wild, unwashed Russians into your home. It's also worth examining the armed forces of Ukraine's strikes in the Black Sea. Ukrainian drone strikes have already made it difficult to deliver imports. From China to Russia through the Black Sea. It turns out that shipping goods in Novorossiysk is now extremely difficult. Freight forwarders are directly advising not to use this route. Because of drone and unmanned boat attacks, they say the situation is unpredictable. Just to remind you, overnight into August 1st, because of a sea drone attack 130 miles from Novorossiysk, the cargo ship Yanina of the Fesco company sank. According to the Russian Union of Grain Exporters and Producers, because of the attacks in the Azov Black Sea region, attention, this season Russia may fall short on wheat exports by as much as 30 to 35 million tons. While analysts had forecast total exports at around 45 million tons, that means they can no longer export most of it from there. Well, they celebrated too soon when the Russians laughed at the ports of Odessa. Well, let's sum up this episode. On the ground, as they say, Russia is preparing offensives that cost huge amounts of manpower against the fortified Donetsk line of strongholds of the armed forces of Ukraine, unfortunately repeating the proven tactic of an aerial blockade of supply lines before the assault. But they are paying for it with record-breaking meat assaults for the third month in a row with minimal progress. Meanwhile, deep in the rear of the Russian Federation, planes are crashing. Meanwhile, deep in the rear of the Russian Federation, a fuel crisis with hundreds of closed gas stations, a collapse in oil refining, loss of food and maritime logistics, and the forced relocation of warehouses to neighboring Kazakhstan. What's next? If the Institute for the Study of War is right about the repetition of the Pokrovsk scenario, the offensive against Sloviansk and Kramatorsk could intensify in the coming weeks. However, Ukrainian strikes on logistics also make it harder for Russia to supply its offensive. Like strikes on logistics, strikes on bridges, which the Institute for the Study of War talks about, are also part of the same transportation system that Ukrainian drones are targeting. The second scenario, economic pressure increases faster than Russia's military successes, which may force the Kremlin to take a more flexible position in negotiations. Although for now, according to Bloomberg, Vladimir Putin is actually toughening his demands. So the war has essentially turned into an open race against time. Who will bleed the enemy dry first? And so far, Ukraine is handling this quite successfully. I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions. Write in the comments below this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to leave a like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.